Cool. So without further ado, we'll get into it. So you've probably heard the term the state a lot, especially in socialist spaces. And frequently, socialists say they want a classless, stateless society. But what exactly that term means is not always easy to grasp, especially since we use the term colloquially in so many different ways. There's the state of Massachusetts, there's the Secretary of State, and there are foreign states. But when socialists refer to the state, we're referring to a very specific institution. This isn't some inane point of theory. Having an understanding of the state is crucial to developing a strong and effective socialist movement. So tonight, we're going to look at how exactly the state functions and the role it plays in socialist strategy. So to begin with, let's start by clarifying what we are not talking about. One thing the state is not is the administration. The administration is composed of people. So these are the Nancy Pelosi's, the Boris Johnsons, even the Xi Jinping's. After all, when we say there's a change of people who fill an office, we don't say we have a different state, we say there's a new administration. The second thing people probably frequently confuse with the state is the form of government. So by this, I mean how in the US we have Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court, but in Britain, they have parliament and a monarch. So these are different forms of government. It's how the state appears in a particular place, but those forms are not themselves the state. In fact, despite the differences in how those governments operate and how they look, places like the US and Britain actually have the same kind of state, that is, a capitalist state. So that raises the question, what does the state actually look like? Well, capital does not exist in the abstract. It is a really existing system made up of really existing social relations requiring certain conditions in order to operate. So under capitalism, the capitalists own the land and the factories, and the workers, who own nothing, provide the labor necessary to produce commodities in exchange for a wage. So already in that definition of capitalism, we can see that there are some certain conditions that need to exist in order for capitalism to function. Owning things requires that private property is something that is allowed and that it's protected. You're not going to get very far if your private property is open to being stolen. Having wage workers means that you don't have indentured servants, you don't have slaves, and it also means that you need to pay the workers enough to survive. That's what the state is for, making sure that those conditions that are required to keep capitalism functioning continue to exist. Now, as socialists, we think of the state as an alienated organ of the ruling class, composed of institutions, especially violent, for the sake of protecting the interests of the ruling class, namely property relations. All right, a lot of buzzwords, I know, but now we're going to dive in and actually break down what that means. So typically in liberal political thought, the state is a body separate from daily life, instituted to deal with the collective issues of society. Now, the first part of that definition is certainly true, and we can see it when we talk about the actions of the state. When a new law is passed, we don't say that we pass the law, we say that the government passed the law. When there's a dispute between two parties, we don't intervene, the state intervenes. Now, this separation between daily life and political life is actually quite important for the survival of capitalism. First, it gives the impression that some things are political and some things aren't. For example, when we talk about unemployment insurance, about how much it should be, or if it should even exist, people recognize that as a political decision. But the fact that you can be unemployed at all, a lot of people just consider that a fact of life. But in reality, everything in society is political, including the way the economy is set up. This separation between public and private, between daily life and political life, is designed to make sure that only certain topics actually get addressed. The second function that this separation serves is to make it so that political power and economic power are considered distinct, meaning that when we want something changed, we make demands of politicians, not the capitalists. And so that has the effect of us seeking to affect change indirectly. And lastly, it means that when we interact with each other in a political manner, we don't interact with each other directly. The state is composed of abstract and atomized citizens, people removed from their real lived context. The separation between daily life and political life serves to separate us from each other and keeps us as isolated individuals rather than united in community. So we've dealt with the first part of that typical or common sense definition, that the state is a body separate from daily civil life. That is to say, we've shown that it's alienated, something other. But now let's deal with that second part, instituted to deal with the collective issues of society. Now, this part is tricky because it seems like it's accurate, right? After all, there are certainly tons of issues that need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed collectively. It's kind of hard to have roads if you're the only one addressing that issue. But the state isn't some neutral organ where we all come together to make decisions. Rather, the state, and this is where socialists depart from liberal political thought, the state has a class nature to it. It is designed to serve capitalist ends through capitalist means. Now, we can see the class nature of the state pretty easily if we look at its history. When the modern state was first developing, it didn't have universal suffrage. Beyond the racial and the patriarchal limitations of the vote, only those with property actually had the franchise. And not only that, but we can actually look how the early modern state was set up. Most legislatures, even to this day, have a system with an upper house and a lower house. The lower house was designed to represent the will of the common people. And remember, when I'm talking about the common people, it's actually already an elite subset of the population that had property. So the lower house was for the will of the common people, and the upper house was designed specifically to stifle that will. In the US, for example, the Senate was originally elected by state legislatures, meaning that senators were elected by a group of people who had enough property to be in a legislature and who were voted in by other people with property. So what that means is that by the time a federal senator was actually elected, there was already 2 layers of filtering out of the opinion of those without property. Now, more than just history, we can also look at the actual laws that the state passes and enforces. By and large, those laws favor those with property and wealth. Stealing a can of soup can result in jail time. Wage theft results in a fine. Whether you own a mansion or only the clothes on your back, it is illegal for you to sleep under a bridge. In a country that believes in the freedom of the individual and the free market, there are limitations on when and how you can strike, but not on when you can close a business. Turns out only the capitalists are truly free. We can also look at the enforcement of those laws. If you have enough money, many laws don't really apply to you. A working person might have to drive a long time to find parking, since a ticket could be a significant portion of their weekly income. For the rich, they can park in front of a fire hydrant if they want to. The ticket they get is merely the price of parking. The IRS disproportionately goes after working people to collect taxes and conduct audits, because the rich have the money to fight the process in the courts. In ways through things like tent encampment bans or jail time for failing to pay a fine, poverty is criminalized. And all of this serves to incentivize people to continue to work, to follow the laws, to be good citizens, and continue to provide subservient labor for capital. Now, this is my favorite example. Complete this phrase and feel free to enter it in the chat. Life, liberty, and blank. What goes in the blank? Yeah, you got it. It's property. The phrase that we learn is life, liberty, and happiness, but the thing that is actually inscribed into the Constitution, the founding document of this country, the highest law in the land, is the protection of life, liberty, and property. So we can see in not just its history, not just the laws, but in the actual structure of the existing state, how it is tied into the capitalist system. But why does this have to be the case? Why does the state have a class nature to it? In order to understand that, we need to understand how the state develops. Now, the state doesn't appear out of nowhere. It emerges historically out of a struggle between classes. In a society without classes, there probably would not be a state. But in class society, there is an exploiting class and an exploited class. And the interests of those two classes are diametrically opposed. For example, feudal lords wanted to collect taxes. Peasants wanted to avoid taxes. Capitalists want higher capitalists want higher profits, and workers want higher wages. The interest of the one is mutually exclusive with the interest of the other. Therefore, the ruling class must find a way to ensure that their interests get advanced. In a way, it's kind of like coevolution between predator and prey. One evolves venom, the other evolves anti-venom. One develops camouflage, the other evolves better eyesight. As the exploited class resists its exploitation, the ruling class develops methods to better subjugate the exploited class and further ensnare it. The state is the culmination of those methods. The state is the system specifically designed to ensure that the economic and class relations of society continue. Modern policing and the development of modern policing, the way that the modern state enforces its laws, it provides an excellent example of this. The modern police force comes out of three locations. In Ireland, when colonial Britain was extracting resources, the Irish rebelled. And so there was an occupying force developed to subjugate Irish rebellion. In the South, enslaved peoples wanted to escape their enslavement. And so slave patrols were developed to return this property and keep slaves within the system. And then right here in Boston, merchants got tired of people stealing their wares and having to pay for the cost of the protection of their property. So they actually were able to get the city to carry the burden of the protection of their wares, criminalizing non-waged means of survival and protecting profits. The modern police force comes out of these three developments, and we can see through it how it is intimately connected with the protection of private property and capitalist rule. At this point, you might ask, how can an institution which so clearly benefits a minority continue to survive? Two ways. The first way is ideology and indoctrination. Now, ideology is composed of those unquestioned assumptions you have about how the world works. The things you think are so basic, they aren't even something you think about, let alone debate. Now, schools are a great example of how this indoctrination happens. So many kids in America grow up saying the pledge, learning about how America is the land of the free. We're told to get a good education so that we can get a good job. We're told that the state is a universal institution where all of us can take part through our citizenly duty of voting, or if we're really patriotic, running for office. These notions are just taken at face value and are pressed upon us as the way that the world simply is. But what they actually serve to do is cover up the true nature of the state so that we don't start asking the tough questions. Now, the more crucial way that the state survives is through violence. Always lurking in the back of that peaceful democracy is the threat of violent enforcement. If you don't follow a law, you will be forcibly detained and possibly beaten. If you threaten the stability of the status quo by striking or protesting, you will be beaten and possibly detained. There isn't much you can do about it. The state makes its enforcers sacrosanct, meaning that it is punishable to resist the actions of the state. Cops, for example, have qualified immunity. By and large, they can't be sued for breaking the law even when they do something illegal. Police brutality only goes in one direction for a reason. If you fight back, you'll just have more charges piled on, because the state cannot have people resisting the laws that it wants to impose. And that's because the state is tasked with promoting law and order. And if you were to ask whose law and on whose order, well, I'm sure you can guess by now. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, well, history can be overturned, laws can be changed, and the Constitution can be amended. We've gotten reforms in the past, why can't we do it again? We can elect politicians who will stand up to the capitalists and rein in the cops. But unfortunately, it's not that straightforward. The way the state functions is tied into the very functioning of capitalism, making it incredibly difficult to get reforms in the first place. And if you can get reforms, they can be severely limited in what they can do. There's a reason why Karl Marx noted during the Civil War in France that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. He recognized that the existing state was fit only for capitalist society and could not be used to bring about the end of capitalism and the transition to socialism. So we're going to now get into why that's the case. Why can't we use the current state to actually make this transition? Well, the immediate barriers are fairly obvious. Capital can influence the state in a ton of different ways. Capitalists can form PACs to run ads, or they can make donations to their preferred candidates. They can even run their own independent campaigns to support their preferred candidate. They can fund lobbyists to pressure politicians to vote a certain way. They can have their stooges placed in important positions which regulate their industry. And if all else fails, there's always good old bribery and corruption. In addition, there's also the inertia of bureaucratic institutions. Now, this is another crucial feature of the capitalist state, its bureaucracy. Laws aren't put into practice by legislators. Instead, there's a whole administrative apparatus of professionals who put those laws into motion. Now, this has two effects. Number one, it further alienates the state from the population. It makes the actual operations of the state further removed from people's daily lives. And number two, it means that any reforms that could happen slowly. So that means there's time for them to be reversed, and there's time for them to be undermined in 1,000 different ways before they actually go into effect. But let's say you're able to get people in office who are willing to make reforms, and you're able to get the bureaucracy made more efficient. There are still severe limitations to what can happen. Now, the state is tasked with managing the economy, making sure that its society stays stable and can survive an economic crisis. Here, again, we see the importance of that separation I was talking about earlier. Whereas in previous economic systems, political power and economic power were united, so that if society went into crisis, you knew who to blame. Under capitalism, economic and political power are nominally separate. Those who run the economy are not necessarily the political leaders, yet the political leaders are the ones the population expects to keep things running smoothly. What this means is that the hands of the government are frequently tied. If officials pass reforms that capitalists don't like, the capitalists have the power through actions like capital flight or refusing to invest to destabilize the economy. And an unstable economy makes it really hard to get reelected and pass more reforms. So this has the added benefit of directing the population's anger away from the capitalists who actually run things and towards politicians. Remember, it's the capitalists who own everything. So they're the ones who decide to raise prices. They're the ones who decide to send jobs overseas. But it's the politicians who get voted out, not the capitalists. Now, it's important to note while we're on this topic that this reaction on behalf of the capitalists to reforms they don't like, that doesn't necessarily require conscious collective activity. Because of the way capitalism is structured, it is in the best interest of each individual capitalist to do something like this, to raise prices or send jobs overseas or to refuse to invest. Because of that, it takes an enormous amount of effort to actually get reforms passed without destabilizing the economy. Again, because of the way the system is set up to encourage individual capitalists to take these actions. More than this though, the other issue is taxes. Taxes, 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 it always comes back to taxes. The state is funded through tax collection. If the economy does poorly, tax yields go down, and the ability to accomplish those large projects decrease. This means that not only is the state limited in what it can do by external factors, but it's actually encouraged to grow the economy and build tax yields, thereby continuing to promote capitalist practices and capitalist relations. The major developments in the welfare state, like things like Medicare or Medicaid, for example, those happened largely during economic upswings when the economy was booming. The same thing that made those reforms possible are also what make them impossible. That's why, despite the fact that socialist governments were elected all across Europe in the 80s, so many of them passed austerity measures because there was an economic crisis going on. In a failing or unstable economy, there is an actual economic limit to the reforms which are actually possible. And this isn't something that's happened in the past. In the past decade, Syriza in Greece had to give up a reform program and pass austerity because of the limits that the economy was setting. If you want to stay in office, you have to take steps to stabilize society. And that means when the economy is in crisis, possibly reneging on reform and passing austerity. Now, there is another issue with reforms. Even if it is possible to pass them, they frequently only end up prolonging the existing system. During the Great Depression, for example, when the economy was suffering, the state launched massive expenditure campaigns to jumpstart the economy. Sure, many people were offered jobs, but in the long run, all it did was keep the capitalist economy afloat and help neuter a growing workers' movement. In the 1950s, when it was becoming obvious that capitalism was grinding down its workers, reforms were passed to protect those workers and allow them to survive the horrors of capitalism. And admittedly, many lives were improved, but it had the long-term effect of ensuring that capitalism had a stable and a willing supply of workers to work for it. So now that we've gone through all of that, we can look back and really understand our initial definition of the state. The capitalist state is an alienated structure, meaning it's separate from the structures of daily life. It's composed of a set of institutions, especially violent, and those institutions promote the interests of the ruling capitalist class. It's an organ of the ruling class because it comes out of the historic development of the class struggle. It's the way that the ruling class organizes to protect their interests, and it's deeply tied into the capitalist economy. Given all of those constraints, how is the working class supposed to take power and overthrow capitalism? We have to remember that states are class organizations. They're set up in ways specific to the interests of the class whose rule they are meant to protect. So, just as the bourgeoisie got rid of the feudal state and replaced it with the capitalist state, so too will the working class have its own organization. The name of the working class state, which protects and promotes the interests of the working class, is called the dictatorship of the proletariat. And it's important to realize that dictatorship here isn't a scary word. It doesn't mean Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot. We can say that the current state is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie because they enforce the will of the capitalist class of the minority upon the rest of society. Similarly, the dictatorship of the proletariat will be the enforcement of the will of the workers, of the majority, over the whole of society. Now that state, that dictatorship of the proletariat, it's going to look different than the capitalist state. In 1870 in Paris, for example, the working class formed the Paris Commune, an institution founded on true universal suffrage, regardless of property, regardless of sex, regardless of race, where every position, from teachers to police officers, was elected, and officials earn no more than the average worker's salary. In 1917, in Russia, Soviets, workers' councils, formed in factories and started coordinating with each other. Eventually, they were able to seize control of state power, meaning that through the Soviets, the workers had the strength to enforce their decisions and protect their interests and overcome the capitalists' attempts to do the same. In order to secure their victory, the Soviets instituted and enforced new laws which limited and outlawed certain capitalist practices, further undermining capitalism's ability to function and strengthening the Soviets. Now, instead of operating on this notion of abstract individualized citizenship, the Soviets were formed by workers as workers. The political and the economic, rather than being seen as two separate spheres of life, were united, and both were placed under the control of the workers. That offered an opportunity for society to be run and for production to be managed, not by the whims and for the benefit of an exploiting and ruling class, but by and for the majority. We have to recognize, though, that the method of working class rule depends upon the existing situation. The Paris Commune and the Soviets in Russia are helpful examples, but they're not blueprints. Paris in 1870 is different from Russia in 1917, is different from America in the 21st century. The point of these examples is not to say these are the exact things we need to replicate, but rather to illustrate that it is possible to completely reorganize how we deal with collective issues and how we run society. But let's face it, this dictatorship of the proletariat, this new set of institutions, they're not going to appear tomorrow. If anything, they won't appear, or at least won't be able to challenge the capitalist state for power until a moment of real crisis. So what should we do in the meantime? Obviously, we have to keep building up the modes of class organization. That means rank and file unions. It means tenant councils. It means political parties, just to name a few. We have to build these up not because these are the forms the working class state will take. In fact, the working class state probably won't look like those things. But we have to build them up because they give the class an experience of political activity, of collective action, and crucially, of resistance. That's not to say that the existing state is useless. It can be used by socialists as a platform for propaganda. We can get our politics on the national stage, and we can demonstrate the limitations of the existing institutions. And this isn't to say that reform is useless either. In the struggle for reforms, the working class learns how to organize itself politically, and it learns the extent of its power. If anything, we have to continue to build a politicized workers' movement that advocates for strong, overarching systemic change. In the end, though, what is crucial is that we continue to keep our eyes on a socialist horizon. Our goal is not a reform of the existing system, if that's even possible. Our goal is not power within the system, if that's even possible. Our goal is a classless and stateless society, one in which we have common and direct ownership of our common and collective affairs. Before I open up for questions, this is where I got most of the information